Welcome to AINdebrief, where we take a look back at the most important aviation news stories of the past week by AIN editors who covered them. I'm AIN Alerts editor Chad Trautvetter. In this week's episode, we'll go over the first quarter results for 4 aircraft OEMs. Wichita-based editor Jerry Siebenmark covers Textron Aviation's quarterly results. I'll provide an overview of Gulfstream's, and air transport editor Gregory Polek brings us up to speed on the situation at Boeing and Airbus. Meanwhile, London-based editor Charles Alcock highlights eVTOL developments this week, while Washington, D.C.-based editor Kerry Lynch talks about what the FAA has done to keep airspace going during the COVID crisis. And I'll wrap up everything with an update on Aerion Supersonic, which announced it is moving its headquarters to Florida. This week we had a bunch of first quarter results coming out, and today was Textron. So, Jerry, let's start with you first. And can you just give us a sense of what's happening at Textron in the first quarter?
Textron had a really bleak first quarter, Chad. They saw their profits plunge about 97% from a year ago. They saw total aircraft deliveries that were basically cut in half, and revenue was down 21%.
But what's the outlook for the rest of the year? What are they saying?
Scott Donnelly, who's the president and CEO of parent company Textron Inc., says that it's not clear at this point with the effects of the coronavirus still being felt. It's really hard for his sales force to get out there and visit with customers, and that's that he says is where they sort of get their information to think about what the rest of the year looks like.
Right, and you have Textron Aviation has a pretty big exposure to NetJets, and NetJets recently said that they're going to defer or cancel delivery, so that affects Textron as well, right?
Yeah, right. Although, it's funny, the nomenclature that Donnelly used was he referred to the $300 million decline in backlog, to which he did attribute to NetJets, but he called that a revised demand outlook, only later saying it was a cancellation. But then again, the way he was talking, it sounded like it was more of a deferral than anything else.
And Cessna also has some other issues too. They had a explosion at Plant 3 at the composite facility, and that's being felt at the company too, right? Right.
He actually said that one of the reasons why they saw to a lesser extent, decline in aircraft deliveries in the quarter was because of that explosion. And they've since worked an arrangement with with Spirit Aero Systems here in Wichita, where they're using some of Spirit's autoclave capacity, while Textron Aviation awaits new equipment.
Interesting. Thanks, Jerry. Okay, Charlie, I'm going to give you the microphone so you can talk to me about Gulfstream.
Absolutely. And Chad, you too have been tracking first quarter results. I believe you tuned in this week to the General Dynamics group call, and your particular interest, I would imagine, was Gulfstream. So what's the outlook there? Right.
Well, Gulfstream seems a lot better than Textron. They seem a lot more optimistic. Phoebe Novakovic, who's the chairman and CEO of General Dynamics, which is Gulfstream's parent company, she was very optimistic. She talked about a lot of interest in the aircraft, but they have an inability to close orders because they can't do in-person sales calls, they can't do demo flights, and they really can't do contract negotiations, which, it's in person. In the quarter, they only delivered 23 airplanes, which is 11 less than they had expected to. But their production rate was the same. They just couldn't deliver those 11 airplanes due to international travel restrictions. So those are more deferred deliveries than any kind of production cut right now. Now, that said, they're having some supply chain issues, and that will affect production this year. So they're downgrading production from 150 aircraft this year to between 125 and 130. But overall, they're pretty optimistic, and they are expecting a rise in private aircraft demand after the post-COVID crisis period, as people look to avoid the airlines, just because of the social distancing and trying to avoid contact with other people.
Yep, thanks for that, Chad.
Greg, so you listened to the Boeing first quarter call. So what's going on the airline side?
Well, Chad, Boeing, the CEO, David Calhoun, said it's going to be a smaller company for a while, and it's pretty clear that'll be the case, judging by the cuts in the production and the workforce he announced. So basically, the company plans on cutting headcount by about 16,000, which is 10% of the entire thing, and 15% of the commercial side will be cut in terms of employees through attrition and voluntary and involuntary layoffs. And then, of course, there's the production cuts they announced, which are pretty severe, more severe than I was expecting, actually. And about half of the 787, the 787 production will be cut basically in half, even though they had already planned on going down from 14 to 10 this year, but now it's going from 14 to 7 in 2022. And then 777 will go from 5 to 3. Next year, it'll be 3. And then, of course, there's the whole MAX saga. Once that returns to service, and by the way, Calhoun says he hopes that it'll be back in service sometime in the third quarter. They're talking about a gradual ramp up to like a baseline of 31 a month next year. Now, before the grounding, it was like 57. And there was talk of it going to 63 at some point. So that's quite a difference. So
what's the story on the other side of the pond with Airbus? Are they in a similar boat?
Yeah, they're in a similar situation. Although they actually cut they announced a 1/3 cut pretty much across their product line a couple of weeks ago, and then this week they talked about how they're going to give it a couple of months to determine exactly what further cuts they're going to make. Probably in June they're going to revisit that, or at least. I don't know if they're going to make an announcement in June or whether they're just that's when they're going to start to really make a decision.
Sounds like a lot of uncertainty on the airline side, right?
Yeah. Well, I mean, the thing is, the reason that there's a lot of pessimism about the wide body market, especially because the thought is that the domestic markets will come back first. Domestic air transport will come back before the international service, and so obviously narrow bodies are used more often for domestic and regional flying. Interestingly, though, the 767 is staying the same. That's because it's mainly all about the tanker and freighters. And the 747, which is really inconsequential anyway, was just 1/2 of an airplane a month, and that's going to be staying the same. But they're all cargo airplanes as well.
All right, thanks, Greg. Thanks for your insight. That was really good. So, Charlie, let's talk about a webinar you listened to this week. It was an MBA webinar. It was about eVTOL. So, what's going on in that segment?
Yeah, it was about eVTOL, and it was all financial news as well, I have to say. So since the COVID-19 pandemic started to do, let's face it, a serious number on the financial markets, people like me who follow the eVTOL sector, the urban air mobility sector closely, have had one big question, and that is, oh my God, might the investment for this new sector start drying up, before it's really got underway? And in this NBA webinar, what we heard was there is a degree of danger on that score, but it's quite nuanced, really. So the venture capitalist groups who, have been identified as a pretty significant potential source of money for eVTOL startups, a lot of them are now looking at their portfolios. And, their first instinct is perhaps to play it safe, make sure that they themselves have enough cash to get through the next 18 months to 24 months of disruption. So there might be, some of the financial analysts and advisors said it's harder to get venture capitalists to talk to these startups. But then at least as interesting was that they said strategic investors, by which they mean, big aerospace companies like Boeing and Airbus and others, they're now exposed themselves through some of the market conditions that Greg just described. And, they may now be having to draw things in and not necessarily invest quite so much. But there's a caveat to that, because they said the companies who will be able to still invest are those that are diversified. Companies like General Dynamics that aren't just in the civil sector, but have significant stakes in the military sector, which is actually still doing okay, even in these difficult times. And then finally, one of the analysts said there's something like 250 eVTOL programs out there, if you believe that. And a handful of them managed to get funding lined up before COVID-19. And basically what we heard is they're now in the driver's seat. They have the money in hand, and they are probably the most likely ones to succeed. What I think we'll see now is what I call an accelerated process of Darwinism, where you'll have the haves and the have-nots, and the have-nots are now going to struggle more, and probably we'll see a lot of consolidation in that sector, which was always going to happen, in my opinion, but it will probably just happen a whole lot faster now.
Yeah, that kind of mirrors the light sports segment about 10 to 15 years ago. There was just over 100 models, and they've been pared down to about a half dozen or so. Also, you listened into the U.S. Air Force Agility Prime I guess that was virtual conference this week. So that's also dealing with eVTOLs, right? And what do they have to say?
Yeah, this is interesting too. And it's interesting because this Agility Prime event's been planned for months, and it was supposed to be an in-person event somewhere in the States. Of course, it ended up going online on the internet, which was convenient for me. And it was really fascinating. What the Pentagon is doing, and more specifically the US Air Force, is saying, hey, we could tap some of this eVTOL technology for our warfighters, as they call them. And, basically they want to be able to use some of these aircraft for all sorts of missions, like moving special forces troops around and taking supplies into the front lines and that sort of thing. So the US Air Force was making an appeal to the private sector and saying, hey, work with us here. We can help support your programs, not necessarily with direct financing, but with things like access to the US Air Force testing ranges where they could do certification work, and just providing credibility to some of these programs that in turn might attract investors who would say, well, if these guys are going to get US Air Force contracts, I might want to put some money behind them. So that was all really fascinating until today's session, when it suddenly, from my perspective, turned a little bit weird, because we started hearing people saying things like, oh, yeah, we want to have these private-public partnerships, but hey, we want to make sure that it's only, friendly investors who are taking part. And of course, some of us said, well, what do you mean by that? What they mean by that is they don't want so-called adversarial investors getting a stake in these military civil programs. And they started spelling it out pretty plainly. They don't want investors from places like China getting into this sector, because there's widespread resentment that the US, essentially through lethargy, allowed the Chinese to sort of get the upper hand in the small drone sector. And, some of these folks are quite determined that's never going to happen again. Now, fine, they're entitled to their opinions, but I think what most people find in aviation is that these programs tend to work best when indeed there is international collaboration and companies from multiple countries taking part. So it's going to be very interesting to see how this so-called trusted investor policy of making sure the right people are on board is going to work in practice. And I have a feeling it's going to unravel somewhat quickly.
There's a lot of Chinese investment in the UAM market, right?
Yes, there is. There's been a lot. And, one notable company that springs to mind is EHang. And just as recently as December, EHang did their initial public offering on the NASDAQ market. They've done flight testing in North Carolina. They're seen as being one of the front runners. They're making real progress. So it will be very interesting to see if, unfortunately, the pot sort of gets soured from their point of view. Again, I'm not trying to make political comments here. I'm just speaking from my experience of watching how aviation programs tend to unfold and where the money tends to flow. And I just don't think that the sort of rhetoric I heard today really fits the narrative that, is behind successful aerospace programs.
Right. All right. Thanks, Charlie. Kerry, let's go over to you. The FAA is here to help you, and that's everybody's favorite phrase, right? So, but actually the FAA was here to help everybody this week. So tell us about that.
Well, I think that the FAA is getting a lot of credit for the massive amount of work they've put in lately to just keep the airspace going and operating and support the operators and everybody within the national airspace system the best they can. And as a matter of fact, the administrator, Steve Dixon, spoke to Flight Safety Foundation's Business Aviation Safety Seminar this week and said, we're going to do everything to keep the system running. And he ran down a lot of the things the FAA has been doing as far as personally to keep it running, to keep the towers operating, to keep controllers separated in different sections to make sure they have available pools. But practically speaking, one of the things that have come up and one of the biggest difficulties with the pandemic is all the deadlines that operators and airmen and technicians face in keeping current, whether it's medical, whether it's training, whether it's just keeping your currency hours, whatever it is. And so FAA has been ticking off one by one all of these requirements to make sure people can keep operating. And they started, of course, with the air carriers with 121 and 135 to attack certain issues with training and with medicals. And just this week, they released what they called a wide-ranging, and in fact it was, special federal aviation regulation that even digs deeper down now, getting into the general aviation pilot and some technicians and some flight training schools. And this, like similar leniencies, kind of codifies some extensions of deadlines. And for instance, if you have a medical that's coming up between now and the end of May, you now have the end of June. If you have to do a flight review, you now have a 3 calendar month grace period from when your flight review was due to expire. And, those are just a couple examples, but it goes on for a range of things. And if you read through the SFAR, it's pretty detailed. I mean, it gets into the MU2 training requirements and the Robinson R22 and R44 training requirements. It covers 91K, the fractionals, in Part 125. It covers airmen and coming back from overseas from the military forces and leniencies that they'll get to keep up with certain certifications. It covers, repositioning aircraft that so-called overflow aircraft, because now we have a bunch of parked aircraft for the airlines. And one of the things that struck me in that the SFAR, Chad, is FAA made a point of noting that it was important to keep as the pool of pilots as full as possible, because especially with business and general aviation, even though they're not air carriers, they provide vital services. And that recognition from FAA is really a key recognition that the industry for years has been trying to gain, well, not just with FAA, because obviously they have some understanding of the industry, but public-wide.
Interesting. All right. Thanks, Kerry. Charlie, I'm going to throw the microphone back to you so we can talk about Aerion.
Yes, Chad, indeed we are. Now, in your home state, Chad, of Florida, I understand there's been some fairly significant news of a new development, and it relates to Melbourne on the other side of the state where you are. Somebody today told me it's going to become the Wichita of the East. What were they talking about?
Well, it could be. Embraer has been there. They chose Melbourne as a site for their Embraer executive jets complex in 2008, and so far they built the Phenom assembly facility, and they have some painting facilities there, and then they have delivery buildings and service center there. So joining them is Aerion. Last Friday afternoon, Aerion announced that they were moving their headquarters to Melbourne on a 60-acre site called Aerion Park. And Aerion right now is based in Reno, and they'll start breaking ground later this year and then move in. I think they said next year they'll move into a facility at Melbourne. And then they start producing, well, at least the prototype. They'll start producing the prototype to fly it in 2023. And one of the reasons they chose Melbourne is because it seems to be a concentration of aerospace companies there. We talked about Embraer being there, but also Lockheed Martin's there. Harris L3 is there. Boeing even has a facility down there. So the Space Coast is very active in airspace right now, not just for space, but just aerospace in general.
That's excellent. Sounds like a great place. I think we should all move there, part of the AIN team. Yeah,
I think we should. Aerion basically chose Melbourne because it needed a location with enough acreage, also a runway longer than 9,000 feet, and it had to be close to a overwater supersonic corridor to be able to flight test its Mach 1.4 AS2 supersonic business jet. Thanks for listening to AINdebrief. Another podcast episode will air next Friday. In the meantime, go to www.ainonline.com for the latest news from AIN.